Hey everybody, welcome to week 8 of Rock Music History and Appreciation. I hope that you are all doing well. Week 8 is a big deal. When you're done with this week, that means that you will be halfway done with the class. So congrats in advance of that. If you are doing good work and you are happy with the level of work that you're doing and the grades that you're getting, awesome, keep it up. If you are not happy with the level of work that you are doing and the grades you are getting, now is the time to turn that around. We are at the halfway point. So start really focusing on that, because at a certain point, you kind of reach a point of no return. I will tell you that right now, you are watching this. I recorded it actually a few days ahead of time. I'm recording it in the evening, and so this is like my 6th attempt because I keep yawning. So if I yawn, I'm just going to keep barreling through. Just forgive me in advance. But I'm sitting in New York somewhere right now. I am here on business. Which I'm in the performing arts business is my day gig anyways. And so, yeah, while you're watching this here, I'm cold in New York right now. But it's pretty cool. And if I was going to record this there and see how it would go, but I didn't know how my time would go, and I didn't want to get crushed. So I figured I better do it ahead of time and be safe. And then by the time we get to the next one, I'll be back home, so life will be good. So anyways, week 8 is folk and folk rock, and for this we're going to jump back in time, kind of back to the beginning, or even before the beginning of this class, and then we're going to head it all the way up into the 60s and early 70s. So as I mentioned way back at the beginning, you know, there's 4 kinds of music. There's cultural ritual music, folk music, art music, and popular music. And the focus of this class, of course, is on popular music, although there are some gray areas here and there. And so folk music exists in all cultures. Every culture in the world has its own folk music. Folk music may have extra musical aspects to it, but it also has social functions to it. And a lot of times folk music, and this goes back, thousands of years, folk music was used to tell stories, and it was told to relate to the news, and it was entertainment, and it was music to dance to. So it's got a lot of functions. One of the main functions, though, is its ability and its intent to communicate ideas. And so in folk music, words are often the most important aspect of a song, not counting, of course, instrumental dance songs, like you think about, square dancing or whatever. But in folk songs, it's not so much about the music as it is about the words, okay? Whatever it is, whether that be a story, poetry, news, message, lot of folk music, particularly as it relates to this class, early on, was very common to be connected to the working class, to the downtrodden, to the oppressed. You had a lot of songs that were related to, workers out in the fields and workers having a hard life. One of the really important songwriters that you need to know is a guy by the name of Woody Guthrie. And I've got back there his book, Bound for Glory. It's a good book to read. It's interesting. 2 videos ago, or a video ago, I guess it was 2 videos ago, I mentioned a book that was on the shelf behind me, and I pointed to it in the video. And some people still got it wrong when I asked the question about what was the book that I pointed to. So hopefully you're not just skipping through these and getting to the questions, because I sometimes ask questions like that. So you go back to folk music, and again, it's this storytelling and entertainment, and has all these functions to it. And it's really, again, about the words. And there were folk groups that existed, again, globally. So you got to think, but we're dialing it into the context of this class. And you had folks like the Weavers and the Almanac Singers. But before that, as recording technology started to come into existence, you had musicologists that were going around and recording the folk songs. Because the thing about folk music is that it is not a notated history. It's an aural history, A-U-R-A-L. So, and an oral history. So meaning that songs are passed by words, and they're passed by sounds. And so it would be very common if you were, a folk musician learning folk songs, you wouldn't go pick up a book of folk songs. You would learn from those that are before you, and they would teach you the songs, and they would teach you the stories. And it was not uncommon, as the stories evolved and changed, for the words to evolve and change with them. So it was not a big deal if, let's say, a song came out, in the 1800s, and then, by the early 1900s, some of the words have changed. The meaning may still be the same, but, the words may be different, and then they change again as the times change. And that's not an uncommon thing. So the folk world has got a different view than say, the popular world, where you have cover songs and the idea is to reproduce them faithfully. Folk songs kind of live and breathe in a different way. So you had people like Alan Lomax and Charles Seeger, who were these musicologists, and they were going about recording these folk songs and putting them down for posterity's sake. And then people started listening to them, and they started learning about them and learning them. And you had Charles Seeger's son, Pete Seeger, who ended up becoming a musician and a really important one in the folk world. And then I mentioned, the Almanac Singers, and then we get to Woody Guthrie. And you're going to be learning about all of this and the traditions that they have. And a lot of those folk songs, particularly in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, they identified with, again, the poor, the oppressed, the working class. It really told their stories and got their stories out there. So when you listen to a song like Woody Guthrie, who wrote "This Land Is Your Land," you may know that song. I would like to think that everybody in here does. But it's I think it's in the materials, but it's a really important song because, the point of it isn't just this patriotic song. He's also basically saying, like, hey, this song, this land belongs to everybody who lives here, from the lowest to the wealthiest. And from all the ethnicities and all of that. Like, this land was made for you and me, is what he's saying. And there's actually a verse or two that often gets left out because it gets a little controversial. And so Woody Guthrie was an important figure. And then you're going to learn about Bob Dylan, who was born Robert Allen Zimmerman. And he ended up changing his name, most believe inspired by the poet Dylan Thomas. And Bob Dylan was very influenced by Woody Guthrie, so much so that he traveled to New York when Woody Guthrie was sick and visited him and learned from him. And it was a pivotal moment in his life. And last week I got, or the week before, got a little heavy in the video, just, which is fine. That's cool. But I also want to put something out. Sometimes in my class, I would bring this up, this idea that, so Bob Dylan was this kid, he grew up in Minnesota, he played in cover bands, played rock and roll songs, and then he became a folk musician, which was a different thing. The rock world and the folk world, very, very different. You're going to learn about that, and that's why it was so revolutionary when Bob Dylan went electric in 1965, which you will learn about as well. And we'll start to learn more about the festivals here. So Bob Dylan, the Newport Folk Festival of 65, you'll learn coming up in the coming weeks, Monterey Pop in 67. You'll learn about Woodstock in 1969, the Isle of Wight. So you're going to learn about all these festivals. But anyways, so I digress. So the thing is that, Bob Dylan kind of changes gear, changes his persona. It really absorbs and takes on the poetic aspect, and that he always viewed himself as a poet. Still does. He's still alive. And please, when you get to his, when you get to the sections on him at the videos, please watch the videos, especially where he gives the award acceptance speech. For that, I want you to make sure that you watch that. And so he does this thing, which is that he travels to New York to meet Woody Guthrie. And that was a pivotal moment, because he could have just stayed in Minnesota and he could have just done whatever. And so, most of the people in this class, you're young, you sort of got your life ahead of you. And sometimes it's easy to get sort of sucked into this sort of, I don't know, this machine, to quote Roger Waters, this educational machinery or factory. You kind of buy into this idea that the point of high school is to go to college, and the point of college is to get a job. And the point of getting a job is, I guess, maybe to make a lot of money, or to do whatever. And those really aren't accurate. The point of high school is to learn. And to start to learn where your strengths are, where your weaknesses are, where your passions are, what you care about. College is a path, one that you are on by taking this class. It is not the only path, and it is not necessarily the best path. If your goal is to, be a great classical musician, then maybe a 4-year university isn't for you. Maybe you should go to Juilliard or you should go something like that. If you are passionate about being an electrician, then you absolutely should not go to a 4-year university. You should go to electrical school and learn a trade. You'll probably end up making more money anyways. So the idea is that you got to sort of identify your passions, and then you set your goals. So what happens is people think, okay, high school leads to college, college leads to job. What you really need to do as you're in high school is you sort of figure out what you're passionate about. And then you set a point out in the distance, and then you got to figure out, well, what gets you to that point, right? So college may get you to that point, a trade school may get you to that point, an apprenticeship may get you to that point. It isn't all the same. It all depends. So Dylan knows he needs to go to New York, and he does, and it changed his life. And he worked hard, and he wrote, and he played, and he in the coffee shops making little money. So my challenge to you is to think about, what are you so passionate about that you would step out of your comfort zone to do if you had a really strong indication that would get you to where you wanted to go? Does that make sense? As a little rambly. I used to do this in my face-to-face classes, but we would have a little discussion about that. So here's the thing to think about. Here's another way to frame it. If you could do anything you wanted and you were guaranteed to be successful at it, what would you do? And I ask you that question. That's a good question to ask yourself every few years, because it can change. The answer can change. And then once you've done that, and the reason I say you're guaranteed to be successful about it is because then you're going to get all the other stuff out of the way. That at least tells you where your passions lie. And then you figure out the path to get to that. So if I, to use a geography example, if I wanted to go to Las Vegas, the thing I wouldn't do is go on the 5 freeway north, right? Maybe a little bit before I started heading east, but I wouldn't stay on the 5 freeway north, because if there's one thing I do know is that it's not going to get me to Las Vegas. It's going to take me to Canada. Okay, so Dylan, there's a point to all of this. There's 2 points. One is Dylan, 2 is you, right? Dylan made this big move, and it became an essential part of his career, and he became hugely influential. So I talked about the game changer of Elvis, the game changer of the Beatles, the game changer that is Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan, it changed the game many ways, and that's why he shows up in different chapters, but he influenced the Beatles, and the Beatles influenced him, and that's why Dylan ended up going electric. His early work, his anti-war work, his work as poetry, lyrics as poetry, as changing songs like the Beatles to create this level of depth that required you to actually sit down and listen to the words. You weren't going to dance to it. You weren't going to make out to it. You weren't just going to throw it on in the background or do whatever. You were going to sit down and listen to the words and try to figure out what he's saying. And sometimes it was obvious, but most of the time it wasn't. And that's because he was a poet is a poet as much as he is a songwriter. So you're going to learn a lot about Bob Dylan. And then you're going to learn about how he went electric in 1965, and as a result, basically kicked off a new genre called folk rock, which combined aspects of folk, the storytelling, that sort of aspect to it, with using rock instruments, which up until Dylan, and even in early Dylan, because he was booed on the stage when he was at Newport, because the idea was that the young people who were listening to music, a lot of Dylan's fans were listening to music for different reasons than, let's say, the Beatles fans were or the Motown fans were. And I want you to think about that, because you're going to get asked about it. Why were those young people listening to Bob Dylan? And it's in the book. All the stuff you need is in the book. But think about, why they're listening to it. And so the attitude of a lot of those young people was that rock instruments and rock music could serve no social positive goal. And what Dylan did was he said, it's not about the instruments. And he went electric, and he was still Bob Dylan. And then as a result, he kicked off this whole thing with folk rock. So you're going to learn about that. And then you're going to learn how that leads into singer-songwriters. Later, you'll learn how Dylan also started, it's in here, but how he kind of started country rock. So he'll come back when we get to that chapter. So there's a lot of bands, a lot of songs There's stuff about the anti-war movement. Again, I want to bring to your attention because it is so important in the 60s. We're back in the US now, right? The impact that Vietnam is having, the impact that, the culture is having, the drug culture, sexual liberation, the civil rights movement, all of these things are going on. You can't separate that out from materials, okay? So you got to think about that all the time when you're dealing with that lens. We don't really have it that same way. Now, keep in mind, there was no social media, but it was in the news every day, all the time. People knew what was going on. So that's the context, okay? So I think that's it. I think that sets it up. Have a great week. You'll get your Thursday reminder like normal. You got your Sunday reminder yesterday. So even though I'm out of town, I'm doing this. I would like to think that I will have time to grade and during this week while I'm out, and we'll see because I've got busy days ahead of me. If not, then I'll just be a little behind in the grading for a little while. But you'll be okay. All right. I think that's it. Have a great week. We'll talk soon. If I can make it a video announcement at some point from New York, I will. All right. Cheers, everybody. Bye.